This console generation so far has given us a wealth of in-game graphics options, with PS5, Series X and, to a lesser extent, titles on Series S, often including a quality and performance mode as a minimum. Coming from South Korean developer Nexon Games then, the first Descendant goes a step further than most. As a free-to-play Unreal Engine 5 loot shooter in the Destiny mold, the first Descendant gives us three main graphics presets, in the form of a 60fps performance mode, a 40fps balanced mode on 120Hz displays, and a 30fps fidelity mode. It's a real luxury of choice, and the main difference between each one is really in native resolution. For each of these modes though, the first Descendant then offers an additional toggle for AMD's FSR3 frame generation. FrameGen takes each of these modes' framerate targets as a kind of base, so either 30, 40 or 60fps, to then generate more frames in between to bring us closer to a 60fps target, or to simply tighten it at 60. That's the theory anyway, but the result isn't nearly as performant as we might have hoped. More on this a bit later. Lastly, at the bottom of the PS5 and Series X graphics menu, we also have a ray tracing mode, which only functions if the FrameGen mode is disabled. All told, not since Hogwarts Legacy or the 2022 Saints Row reboot have we seen so many graphics options on console. There are so many permutations here, and I'd contend that the first Descendant falls into the same trap as each of those games. As a console release, it offers too many ways for an end user to simply ruin their playing experience, with options that either simply do not work or drastically underperform. So just how does each mode run on PS5, Series X and S between fidelity, balanced and performance? Also, how successful is the frame generation toggle combined with each of these modes in pushing for a 60fps target, and fundamentally, which is the best way to play? And lastly, what's going on with ray tracing on console? Let's find out. On the topic of ray tracing, let's nip the issue in the bud right away. On PC, there's a generous suite of options to tinker with. We have Nvidia's DLSS 3.5 support, AMD's FSR3, we have ray reconstruction, and of course, multiple tiers of ray tracing quality, allowing at best a combination of RT reflections, shadows, and ambient occlusion. In comparing the impact of ray tracing, disabled versus enabled at ultra quality, it's a respectable upgrade if you know where to look, creating a greater depth to shadows and also adding more detailed reflections to character armor. At ultra settings, it's also incredibly taxing for most GPUs. Even my RTX 4080 machine here needs DLSS or FSR3 frame generation to kind of bridge the gap to a smoother frame rate. The point being, while PC's ray tracing support demands a form of FrameGen technology to run well, that's simply not the way the console versions work. On PS5 and Series X, it's either FrameGen enabled or ray tracing enabled, and never shall the twain meet. It's one or the other. And to further confuse matters, actually enabling the ray tracing mode on Xbox Series X in this case seems to have very limited impact to the world's shadows, reflections, and ambient occlusion. We do get a minor difference in ambient occlusion around the character on Series X here, but it's nothing close to what PC offers in comparison with its ultra quality mode. Added to that, stability is a huge issue here, with RT mode crashing on PS5 and Series X here multiple times during testing. In this case, I simply ended up having to close the game manually. In terms of the frame rate, it does hold at 30fps so far, looking at the PS5 RT mode, but the visual gains are simply too minimal to justify the potential software freezes. So this might be one to revisit once Nexon Games deploys more patches. For now though, PC is clearly the most dependable route to ray tracing support, if your machine is able to handle it. All of which leads us to the modes that do work on console. Given that there are still so many permutations to cover, let's flash up a table for clarity. Firstly, there's the basic 3 modes with no FrameGen involved. PS5 and Series X are identical in their setups, having tested each extensively. For the most part, The main difference between each mode is in native resolution and FPS target. The 30 FPS fidelity mode and 40 FPS balanced mode, for example, each run with a 4K target. A true 3840 by 2160 that's perfectly achievable by looking right up at the sky or around less taxing interiors. But these modes do have some flexibility in pixel output to keep the frame rate smooth. To hit a stable 30 FPS line on PS5 and Series X, we go down to 1440p on the fidelity mode at worst, and to hit 40 FPS on the balanced mode, we go to an even lower 1170p reading. There is a bizarre issue on Xbox machines though, in that the 40 FPS readout is unevenly frame-paced, with sudden spikes up to 45 FPS. On PS5, we get a perfectly smooth 40 FPS cap that suffers from no issues at all, so it's really a problem that needs to be addressed on Series X and S. I must say though, to the game's credit, the 30 FPS fidelity mode runs remarkably well. I've only had occasional drops under 30 FPS in my testing on both PS5 and Series X, with the worst case scenario actually being this streaming hitch on the first mission, plus these single dropped frames during any camera cut in cutscenes. As for gameplay, we're often at a smooth 30 FPS otherwise, which is great news. As for the balanced mode, you will again need to be outputting at 120Hz to access that mode, but the jump to 40 FPS is at least well held on each console. Next along, you'll have noticed the performance mode has a different setup entirely. On PS5 and Series X, this guns for 60 frames per second, but with a lesser 1440p target that dynamically drops to 720p lowest. Usually we operate at numbers in between, often closer to 900p, but curiously, the entire image only ever aims to reconstruct back up to 1440p. The bottom line is that image quality takes a hit, and I noticed shadow and post effects, like depth of field, also take a hit in quality. As for performance itself, PS5 and Series X do reap the rewards for dropping the resolution bounds. 60 FPS is sadly far from a 100% lock, but it's still stable in most areas. The main problem area seems to be this stretch around the initial Kingston region. We get this big traversal hitch as we turn the corner, and also afterwards, single dropped frames as enemies spawn in ahead. It's a frustration, obviously, that it's not a tight lock at 60 as it should be, and likewise, we again have dropped frames between every camera cut during in-engine cinematics on PS5 and Series X. The overall turnout for gameplay, with those semi-frequent drops to 59 FPS, does make it less than ideal, though overall it is still the best way to play on PS5 and Series X. Moving on, what about the frame generation toggle? Let's put this in a three-way split, focusing on Series X first. Again, you'll need to set the machine to output at 120Hz to access the frame gen toggle, and also this pushes every mode to target 60 frames per second instead. As far as the pixel counts are concerned, everything changes as well. Here's the revised table. On every mode, performance, balanced, and fidelity, adding AMD's FSR3 frame gen changes the resolution to a fixed target, rather than a dynamic one. Fidelity mode locks at 1260p, balanced mode at 1080p, and performance mode locks at 840p. It stands to reason that fixing the values like this gives the frame gen technology a constant pixel structure to work with no deviations to confuse it. It's easy to conceive that changing the resolution by the frame might cause misinterpretations and less accurate frames generated in between the typical rasterized frames. On another note, while we've got all three paired up here in a comparison, you'll spot how the visual settings between all three modes are actually very close. The depth of field effect lowers a setting on the performance and balanced modes during cinematics. Likewise, shadows up close on character faces are also lowered in quality, noticeably on the performance mode here. But above all, it's really the resolution divide that stands out most, and has the biggest impact on the frame rate. The frame rate readings speak for themselves, in showing that the performance mode is still the only one capable of getting to 60 FPS often enough, with FrameGen enabled or disabled. It's also clear that there are big problems using this toggle regardless of mode. Firstly, the fidelity mode too often falls below the 60 FPS targets with FrameGen, coming in instead at 50, 40, and even the mid 30 FPS region during cutscenes. It's impossible to recommend using fidelity mode this way, and honestly, it's a dead end in terms of any practical use case. Balanced mode, equally, works better as a capped 40 FPS experience with no FrameGen enabled. It does rise to 60 FPS and match the performance mode 60 FPS line in simpler areas, but cutscenes and any explosion-heavy gameplay tends to settle near the 50 FPS line, and in the worst case, the mid-40s. In fact, at points in cutscenes, it'll now even go under 40 FPS, where disabling FrameGen would cap it at the 40 FPS line. Finally, the performance mode with FrameGen enabled has no real advantage here, and I'd even go so far as to say it only adds more issues. The drops under 60 FPS are more frequent, perhaps owing to how it runs at a fixed 840p with FrameGen, which is higher than the 720p lower bounds of its dynamic setup with it disabled. The higher GPU demands mean more drops to the base frame rate. On top of that, performance mode also runs with an unevenly frame-paced line where it does hit 60 FPS within a 120Hz output. All of which means there are moments where the frame times spike above 16.7 milliseconds to let the game run at, say, 65 FPS for a spell, creating this erratic, choppy result. None of this happens, to be clear, when running at the regular 60Hz output with no FrameGen involved. To compound this issue, on a 120Hz display, we noticed that, bizarrely, VRR doesn't engage properly on PS5 or Series X to smooth out the result. It outputs at 60 frames per second throughout at best, and overall, the frame time reading is more choppy with FrameGen enabled. In summary then, across all three modes, the first Descendant runs better with no FrameGen option involved, which does feel like a wasted opportunity. Next up is PS5 running the same gamut of tests across all three modes, but with a crucial twist. As it stands, PS5 runs with a frame generation target set to 90 FPS, rather than the 60 on Series X and S. All resolution metrics are identical to Series X, but it does mean that PS5, at its peak with performance mode and FrameGen selected, will output 50% more frames per second than the other consoles. It's an odd fit too, slotting 90 frames per second within a 120Hz output, and equally, it's clearly a stretch for the fidelity mode to generate triple the number of frames from a baseline 30 FPS. We know that doubling to 60 frames per second is already too ambitious for the fidelity mode with FrameGen enabled as well, let alone tripling it. Still, these results show performance mode plus FrameGen hitting the 90 FPS line more often than you'd expect. It's between 70 to 90 FPS most of the time in gameplay, albeit with highly erratic readings on the frame time graph. As for the balanced and fidelity modes, this is clearly too much of a stretch for those. Again, in every mode, we found VRR didn't engage as it should to resolve those erratic frame times. Even at 90 FPS then, FrameGen is still not as useful as it should be on Sony's hardware, and often disabling FrameGen for a more consistent 60 FPS is a better way to go. One final point before we check out the Series S situation. In comparing PS5 against Series X directly, using their fidelity modes to really push it, plus FrameGen in tow, it's clear PS5 has a lead in every test. Matching gameplay isn't a precise art, admittedly, but the PS5 reading is often 10 frames per second higher, and sometimes beyond that. Again, I'd be hard-pressed to really recommend using FrameGen with any mode on either console, but for whatever reason, the PS5 version is able to generate more frames this way. Otherwise, visually speaking, the two are a match in every regard. Resolution targets, textures, effects quality, post-processing settings, it's all matched. So, a curious aside, but it does bear mention, and hopefully the mode will improve with more patches, given that Nexon already appears keen to make major changes to the game post-launch. The last test, of course, pertains to Xbox Series S, where the most critical change is in resolution. We keep all the basic modes in place from PS5 and Series X, including performance, balanced, and fidelity, plus we get the frame gen toggle for each on a 120Hz display. Except in order to hit 30 FPS on fidelity mode and 40 FPS in balanced mode, Series S targets 1440p at best, with 720p as the lower bounds. As a 30 FPS capped experience, it is robust overall. You're getting single dropped frames in gameplay and more often in cinematics during camera cuts, but it's stable otherwise. The 40 FPS balanced mode, on the other hand, is very hard to recommend. Series S's 40 FPS cap simply does not work as it should, and instead we have fluctuations up to 45 FPS, just as we saw on Series X. Last up is the performance mode, which drops us to a 1080p target with 540p as the lower bounds there. Yes, that's practically a PlayStation Vita level resolution, all in an attempt to hit 60 FPS on Series S. And even then, the turnout is unfortunately a pretty laboured one. 60 FPS is possible for stretches of play, but even in the first mission area, Series S too often nosedives into the mid-40s. Ultimately, with the performance modes, major sub-60 drops, and the issues with balanced mode's 40 FPS cap, it really does fall on the 30 FPS fidelity mode as the recommended way to play on Series S right now. It's more of an academic point, but Series S does offer the same frame gen toggle as Series X and PS5. Here's the final table showing the metrics for each mode, with AMD's frame gen in the mix. We're running at a fixed 640p on the performance mode, 720p on balanced mode, and 840p on the fidelity mode. In terms of visual settings, most presets are a match for PS5 and Series X here. That is with the exception of shadow quality, which is visibly downgraded on all modes on Series S, and generally falls closer to the performance mode on the higher powered machines. As for the frame rates, well, we're faced with similar problems too. Performance mode is largely unimproved on Series S with frame gen added in, running as it does between 45 to 60 FPS in gameplay. Even at that top 60 FPS line though, it's also unevenly frame paced, and overstretches the mark with lilts up to 65 FPS. Again, this is an issue added only with frame gen. The balanced and fidelity modes fare much worse by comparison, and really are barely worth considering in any scenario. We're between 30 to 40 FPS on each, where fidelity mode even has moments dropping into the high 20s. Much like PS5 and Series X, there isn't a single use case where this is of any value to the player on the 4 teraflop console. We're much better served with the flat 30 FPS cap of the fidelity mode with no frame gen, especially so on Series S. So again, it's a shame that frame gen isn't utilised well enough here to smooth out the motion. Without a doubt, the first Descendant needs more work on console. I've had a range of issues and oddities so far, ranging from ugly, decimated player animations in the hub area, to crashes with the ray tracing mode enabled, at least initially. Towering above those issues though, is the sticking point of the game's frame rate delivery on systems that should do a lot better, given that the game has last-gen consoles in mind too. PS5, Series X and S offer plenty of modes here, and additional permutations with its frame gen toggle, but only a couple of combinations here truly lead to a solid playing experience. On PS5 and Series X, I'd suggest the 60 FPS performance mode as the ideal way to play today, and also I'd avoid the frame gen toggle all round since it fails to hold at 60 FPS on any mode. On Series S, meanwhile, the only mode that seems viable is the 30 FPS fidelity mode. Again, this really does point to the failure of the frame gen option to fill in the blanks and achieve a perceptual 60 FPS result, while issues with its standard 40 and 60 FPS modes linger. The overwhelming sentiment here then is that the first Descendant is generous on options but lacks the common sense to set most of them up properly. It sets the players up for a fall where too many options lead to poor performance, and instead, a limit to just the ones that work would be far better. Looking at the game more broadly, there is a lack of polish all round that needs addressing, and in particular looking at console, we really need to see the ray tracing mode running crash free. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly with myself and the team, you know where to find us. But from me for now, thanks for watching.